Okay, good morning, students.
Good morning, sir.
So now it is 11:05. So I find 16 students are now in this class. So I'm starting today's class. And so just a brief repeat what we did yesterday in our last class. That I tried to explain that what are the very basics of field computation, why it is needed, and what are the procedural steps, and so on. And I also tried to mention that why is it important to know electric field. Now today I will start from that point that why uh, we should at all do field computation. So I will share a small file to explain it to you. Okay. So I hope you will be able to see now. I don't think it is coming. Is it coming on your screen? Yeah, that is true. Okay, that I will change. Okay. Uh, Now you are seeing the full slide, one slide.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. I will not go into the full screen mode. Sometimes that creates trouble. So I will keep it like this. So I will explain the importance of field computation with this example, which is a very, very practical example and very important for power technology today. This is something that you might have heard called gas insulated substation. In short, we call it GIES. And now there are also gas insulated transmission lines, that GIL in short. These are called new age technology for bulk power transmission. They are not for simple 100 kilowatt or 1 megawatt or 10 megawatt. They are for very large power transmission of the order of gigawatt. Now, why is it so? For that, I will show you a figure. Now you can see a very modern city, and now it is probably very difficult for you to imagine how much power is drawn by this city, or at least part of this city. To explain this, I will try to tell you that all of you probably must have seen South City Mall in Marshall Road. The South City Mall, as I am told, they require a power of the order of 2 to 3 megawatt. Megawatt, right? Now, if one mall takes 2 to 3 megawatt, now you look at this city and try to imagine how much power it will require. It's unthinkable. I mean, for an ordinary person. But even more complicated is to deliver that power, we require substations and the equipments. And they will be high voltage equipments. Otherwise, we cannot transmit that huge power. Now, the question is where do we set up that substation? Where is that land? Because in such cities, land is of extravagant price. Even the best power companies will not be able to buy land for a substation. It doesn't make sense to pay that much of money for land. And secondly, because of lot of concern of safety, security, the local administration will not allow to make an open air substation here. So then, what is the solution? So that solution came uh, as the gas insulated substation, where everything has been minimized, but air insulation doesn't work. So it is gas insulated, but that gas is sulfur hexafluoride, SF6. And SF6 also not at atmospheric pressure because we need very high dielectric strength, so it works at the order of 6 to 7 atmospheric pressure. And then the whole thing can be minimized. For that, I will show you a photograph. This is a real life photograph given to me by Siemens. I have given the name Dr. Herman Koch of Siemens. He gave this photograph to me. Now you can see written here that underground GIS substation, the place is called Winterthur Altstadt. Altstadt means old city. This is in Switzerland. And you can see it is a soccer field. And this substation on the small inset is below this soccer field. It's a 110 kV with the current rating of 2.5 kiloampere. So 110 kV into 2.5 kiloampere, you can calculate the megawatt. Right? You can clearly see 25 into 1.1, it is 27.5. So it is 275 megawatt capacity. And this is an old city. This is not a modern city. So power requirement is 275 megawatt. And people or children playing on this soccer field, they will not be able to. They even probably don't know that this substation is there. Otherwise, they will be very much scared. But that's the beauty of technology. That technology has gone up to that level and with that safety. Because if there is not enough safety, they will not allow the local administration. But this miniaturization, as you can see in the inset, that is also there are certain issues. So I will show you a photograph to understand that. Now you can see the actual design of the GIS, again given to me by Siemens. Uh, the outer cylinder is actually the arched enclosure, which is of course metallic, and the inner cylinder that you can see is the high voltage conductor. That's how the GIS is designed. This is typically a coaxial cylindrical system. And this is an actual photograph of a GIS. Of on top you can see it is a 345 kV GIS. Now there is a scale placed here to show you that what is the spacing between the high voltage conductor and the earth conductor. Now you can clearly see it is 4 inches, which is about 10 centimeter. 10 centimeter, and the voltage difference is 345 kilovolts. Can you imagine? 10 centimeter. You can take a scale if it is in front of you, find out how much is 10 centimeter, and then imagine that there is 345 kV. But the fact is that it is withstanding that voltage or the electric field. If I have to provide the same, you know, uh, insulation using air, that means the open air substation, that is also written on top, AIS, air insulated substation, that 4 inches which we are giving in the GIS, that will become 15 feet. 15 feet we require. So can you imagine the minimization that has been done? That is the beauty of the design that our engineers have been able to achieve, and it is highly reliable. Let me tell you, this is highly reliable. This is GIS, and if we go into GIL technology, this is on the right side is the actual diagram of a 400 kV GIL. This is not a photo. It's a actually CAD generated diagram, not a photo. Nowadays, CAD is so powerful, it looks like real life, this thing. So you can see this is thus again outer cylinder, which is arched enclosure. Then this is central conductor high voltage. This is a 400 kV GIL. And then there is a white color insulator, two insulators in the form of a V supporting this inner conductor. Otherwise, the inner conductor will fall because of the gravity, as you understand. And by the way, this is exactly the project I was telling in my last class. I worked in 1998 in Siemens, and all these photographs, etc., we I collected from them. And equivalently on the left side, you can see a 220 kV XLP cable where the insulation is solid insulation, layer after layer, whereas in this case it is just gas. You can see these white insulators are for support only, the rest is all SF6 gas. These are the the CAD drawings which we used to generate. So you can see this is the inner left top electrode. This is the insulator. Now it is always important that how you fix the insulator. Fix the insulator within the inner electrode, because remember it has to be mechanically solid, otherwise there will be slippage, and because of slip it will fall. So this smaller part will go into this cylindrical hole, into this cylindrical hole, and this larger part will rest on the outer enclosure. So it is like this. If you look closely, you can see the white one. It has gone into the inner conductor, and the larger dia is resting on the, here you can see, on the outer cylinder. There are other designs also. Here you can see it's a three insulator design, not two insulator. Here you can clearly see how it is done. But here the fixture design is different. Here it has not gone into the inner electrode. You can see it is sort of a ring formation. And from that ring, there are three insulators 120-degree apart. So this is how the miniaturization has been done. And this is the actual, left side is the actual diagram. This is installed in Geneva, Switzerland, 300 kV GIL. And you can see 6 cylinders. By the way, this one, as you can see on the right, is one cylinder only. That means one phase. And here you can see 6 cylinders running, and this is running through a tunnel to house these cylinders. So you can see that this is a double circuit transmission line. I hope you understand what is called a double circuit transmission line. That means there are two three-phase lines running. So you can see ROIB, ROIB running. And on the right side, it just shows a model that how it is running. This is the lab where I have worked, and testing is going on of a 420 kV GIL, again from Siemens, this photograph. So you can see the lab. It's such a fantastic lab, and this is, you can see the horizontal on the floor is the GIL. So actual testing is going on. So I told you that all the design prototype has been made, but then finally it has to be actually tested by applying the real life stresses. And now you can see, I don't know whether you can recognize me in 1998. This is where I actually worked. This is the 420 kV GIL prototype at Berlin, where I was working. So I visited that place, and these are the real life prototypes where all the tests, etc., are being done. It's a double circuit GIL. And this is the, I told you Dr. Herman Koch, with whom I worked there. He was the boss of that, heading that division of that GIL. Now he is retired from service, but we are still very good friends. So now, saying all that, most important thing is this diagram, that with such a small spacing, when we are designing a 300 or 400 kV system, you have to estimate the field very, very accurately. because the moment you make a mistake, in all probability it will fail. And by the way, these are very expensive equipment, so uh, I mean nobody will accept that this will fail due to design mistakes. So that's why we need field computation and to be very precise. So with this background, I am stopping sharing of this one, and I am moving on to another one now. This is the actual topic where I am going. Now you probably will be able to see I have even, yeah. So you can see the file now.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now finite difference method. Now if you remember that in our last class I told that what are the different procedural steps in field computation. Step number one I explained is identification of the region of interest, that is where I want to know the field. Step number two is uh, discretization of the uh, region of interest and thereby creating the nodes where I am going to compute the field. Now, this discretization raises a lot of questions that how do I discretize? Now, one very simple example is this one, that I can make, if it is a two-dimensional test, I can make it, you know, simple squares. So I will create nodes. But when I do that, naturally a question will come that uh, why square? Square means that distances are all equal. Is it really a uh, practical assumption? The answer is no, because uh, what we do in particularly in this FDM is that there has to be some sort of potential distribution that need to be assured. What do I mean by potential distribution? That means between the two nodes, what is the nature of potential variation? That I have to assume, otherwise I can't write the equation. I can assume any type of distribution. I can assume a linear distribution. I can assume quadratic or whatever. But as you know, if we go for higher order distribution, the equation becomes much more complicated. And the accuracy does not increase necessarily. So in 90% or more cases, linear potential distribution is assumed, which is quite good. We get quite good result. But then when I say linear potential distribution, then the question will arise that how do you know that the potential is linearly distributed between the two nodes? The answer is I do not know. But uh, there are certain aspects. For example, you all know that if I have a curved line, I can subdivide that curved line into small segments. Then each small segment can be assumed to be a straight line. And if I want to be a really straight line, I make it a very small segment. This is called piecewise linearization. Probably you are aware. So here you follow the same principle that if I take these nodal distances to be adequately smaller, then this assumption that the potential is varying linearly between two nodes will be valid. But if that is the case, then if my region is large, there will be very large number of nodes because nodal distances are small. So this is not a very practical thing. So what we have to do? So we have to do something different. What is that? This concept of, you can see here at the top, that equal nodal distance, we have to drop that. But that I will show you later. First, I will start with the explanation of equal nodal distance because that is easier to understand. Then unequal nodal distance I will explain. But before that, there is one more thing I have to explain. Here you see the heading is two-dimensional system with equal nodal distance. And this diagram you can see it's a two-dimensional system. All nodal distances are h, etc. And it's an xy Cartesian coordinate system. But now I have a question. This I have to answer to you, that why I am explaining two-dimensional system to you. Is it practical or is it purely theoretical? Because in our real life, nothing is two-dimensional. Even a sheet of paper, that is also three-dimensional because there is some thickness. So why I am assuming two-dimensional? Is there anything uh, that validates it? Well, yes. How do I explain it? For that, again, I will show you this uh, file, then you will be able to understand. Because this is a very important concept. This is purely a concept. Okay, now hopefully you will be able to see. Correct. Now I think you are able to see. Now you see, take the case of this cable on the left side. It's a three-dimensional cable, isn't it? No doubt about that. And just on the right of the cable, you can see this circular figure. What is this? This is the cross-sectional diagram of this cable. Now, if this cross-sectional diagram is definitely a two-dimensional plane, and the central circle is high voltage, the outer circle is earth, and rest are insulation. So, if I take different points here, I will get different potential and field. Or in other words, potential and field are varying on this plane. It's a two-dimensional plane. That means it is varying with x and y coordinates because every point has different x and y coordinates. So it is varying with x and y coordinates. But if I take now this cross section at another location, it's the same cable, then this cross sectional diagram doesn't change. It remains the same. Which means that if you take a particular point at a given value of x and y, its potential and field will depend on this conductor or insulation geometry. Now, at a different point on along the axis, that means I take the cross section at a different value of z, because z is along the axis of the cable. Cross section is the xy plane. So for a given xyz, if I take a point at a different z, I can see that the insulation configuration, electrode configuration remains absolutely same, which means the potential or the field will not vary with Z. It will vary only with X and Y. Therefore, this cable, I can say that the field is varying only with the X and Y coordinates, which is on the cross-sectional plane, and it is not varying with the Z coordinate, which is along the length of the cable. Or in other words, it's a two-dimensional field. But the geometry is really three-dimensional. That means we have to somehow prove that the field is not varying along one of the coordinate axes. Then that particular configuration becomes a two-dimensional configuration. So there are a lot of such examples, particularly coaxial cylindrical systems, where we assume this two-dimensional configuration. For example, if you take the transmission line, now if you take the vertical plane at different distances, you will see the geometry remains same. Of course, you ignore the sag, so it becomes a two-dimensional configuration. Of course, not near the tower, but away from the tower. So in this way, we can show that there are a lot of examples which are practical, but the field does not vary along one of the coordinate axes. Hence, it is a two-dimensional field. And based on that, we are now explaining to you the two-dimensional uh, two-dimensional fields. Uh, where is my yes? No. Plane, the field will vary on the plane of the region of interest. Otherwise, what's the point in computing the field? The correct. Yes, that is what you have to establish by proper reasoning. Then it becomes a two-dimensional. Yes, that is correct. So, for example, here now I am assuming that this is. Oh no, I have not shared. I think. Have I shared? No. Yeah, now I have shared. Now it will come. I hope now it is coming.
Yes, sir.
So now you see, this is what we are going to do based on this, explanation, that we are assuming two-dimensional system, and for simplicity, I am taking equal nodal distance. Of course, with the basic assumption that the potential distribution between two successive nodes is linear. Now, since it is two-dimensional system, so the Laplace's equation, I am going to solve the Laplace's equation. So Laplace's equation, you know that del 2v del x square plus del 2v del y square plus del 2v del z square is equal to 0. But since field is not varying along the z, for example, if z is along the length of the cable, so del 2v del z square is 0. So Laplace's equation is as shown in equation 1. And now we have subdivided the region by a square discretization, and these are the nodes. The target node where I am going to write the equation is always, I am using the convention that it is always the node 0. And the first question that comes is, this node 0 is connected to how many other nodes? Right? Because of course, the discretization. It is quite clear that the target node is connected to 4 other nodes. So now that I have shown 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 3 along the x-axis, 2 and 4 along the y-axis. So it is quite obvious that since potential distribution is linear between the two nodes, so the potential of node 0, let's say it is V0, this must be related to V1, V2, V3 and V4. No doubt about it. Now what is that relationship? Of course, satisfying the Laplace's equation. Can I find it? That's what our target is. So I will show you two derivations. One a little bit, not very rigorous. Other one is a rigorous derivation. Now this one, not so rigorous derivation, is like it's called like the mean value theorem. So what I am going to say is that A and B, as you can see, are midpoints between 0 and 1, that is A. 0 and 3, the midpoint is B. Since the potential distribution is assumed to be linear, so I can always write equation 2, that is del V del x at A can be written as V1 minus V0 by H. H is the nodal distance. Now why V1 minus V0 I have taken, not V0 minus V1? Reason is very simple, that 1 is in the increasing direction of x compared to 0. So I have taken V1 minus V0 by H. Following the same logic, I can write del V del x at B. That means here you can see in the figure, B is the midpoint of 0 and 3. So it will be V0 minus V3 by 8, not V3 minus V0, because 0 is in the positive direction of x compared to node 3. So you can see I can get two expressions of del V del x, one at A and one at B. Now extending this logic, we can say that A and B being midpoints, then and all the nodal distances are equal, then node 0 is the midpoint between A and B, no doubt about that. So I can, from the two expressions of del V del x, I can now go for the second order derivative, that is del 2V del x square at the node 0, that can be related to del V del x at A and del V del x at B. How? Very simple. The del 2V del x square at the node 0, then that should be equal to del V del x at A minus del V del x at B by H. Now why H? Because what is the distance between A and B? That is definitely H. Because A and B are the midpoints. So I get an expression for del 2V del x square at 0, node 0. Equation 4. What is that? V1 plus V3 minus 2V0 by H square. Just follow the same logic in the y direction here. And I get an expression for del 2V del y square at the node 0. What? Equation 5. The same logic as in 4. Then I put the Laplace's equation at the node 0 because I have to satisfy the Laplace's equation at the target node. So del 2V del x square at node 0 plus del 2V del y square at node 0 is equal to 0. That's the Laplace's equation at node 0. So I put these two from equation 4 and 5, and I can get an equation for V0, which is equation 6. Now this equation, you can see equation 6 is coming from satisfaction of the Laplace's equation. So this equation 6 satisfies Laplace's equation. And therefore this one is called the FDM equation, but only for two-dimensional system with equal nodal distance. But then what is the features of this equation 6? That is important to know. Because this equation you may not remember after 5 years, but remember the features. What this method has done, this is the beauty. See, we are solving Laplace's equation, which is a second order partial differential equation. But we have reduced it to equation 6 by FDM methodology. And equation 6 is a linear equation. It's a very clearly linear equation, and it involves only electric potential, which is a scalar quantity. So therefore, equation 6 is a linear equation involving only scalar quantities. That's the beauty of the mathematical derivation proposed by FDM. When it was proposed, that was the beauty, because earlier people were all solving the partial differential equation. But here it is a linear equation. And it is very, very simple to solve. And nowadays with computers, it is absolutely simple. And that is what we try to do in probably all numerical methods. But now here you can raise a question that all this derivation was based purely on that linear assumption. And I told that every method has some assumption. This is that assumption in this case. And that gives rise to the error in the final result. Because I don't know whether this assumption is really correct. But anyway, can I prove this without going through all that mean value and others? The answer is for that I will require application of a very rigorous theorem or you know what is called Taylor series. Now Taylor series you must have done in your first year or so, but I will recall that Taylor series equation 7. Of course, I have written it in two dimensional because if it is a three dimensional, there will be a z term in it. Now, Taylor series is a formidable series when you look at it. But just look at it and then try to see what is actually Taylor series. If you look at the left hand side, you see it is fx plus a y plus b. If you look on the right hand side, it is fxy. Now, first, what is fxy? This is important to understand. Xy are definitely the coordinates, and for a given value of x and y, what I get is a point on the two-dimensional plane. And fxy therefore stands for an electrical quantity or any other quantity at that point. It could be electric potential, it could be electric field, or it could be temperature, it could be velocity. So fxy gives the value of that quantity at a point on the two-dimensional plane. Then what is x plus a and y plus b? A and b are two constants. So for the same set of value of x and y, x plus a and y plus b is a second point displaced from the first point, that is x and y, by a and b. Now this equation 7, if you look at it, what it is telling you is that if I know fxy at x and y, that means at the coordinate of x and y, and if these partial derivatives are known, then I can always get the value at the second point without going into any computation by this series. This is what the Taylor series says. And that's what exactly I am now going to use. How? It is like, say, coming to this figure. Now I am going to apply Taylor series between 0 and 1. By the way, Taylor series is applicable for not very large distances, but for smaller distances. That is 8. If I apply this between 0 and 1, then how does it look? That V1 is fx plus a y plus b will be related to V0. So V0 is fxy. Now if V0 is fxy and V1 is fx plus a and y plus b, can you tell me what is the value of a and b? Quite clearly, again go back to the figure, this target node 0 is the coordinate xy, target node 1 is x plus a y plus b. So quite clearly a is h, b is 0. And that's exactly what I have taken here. You can see here a is h, b is 0. And then I have put it in equation 7. If x plus a y plus b is therefore v1, if xy is v0, then the first term a del x of fxy. So I have written a is h, then del v del x at 0 because it is fxy, so it is at the node 0. B is 0, so eliminated. Then a square by factorial 2, so h square by factorial 2. Then del 2b del x square. at xy, that means at node 0, and I am ignoring the higher order terms. And since I am ignoring the higher order terms, that will bring some error in my field computation. This is what I try to tell, that why the errors come. Then if I do this between nodes 3 and 0, what happens is this A becomes minus 8. Why? Because I am moving from 0 to 3, because 0 is x and y, 3 is x plus a, y plus b. So then A becomes minus 8, B is 0, and therefore I can write equation 9. And then from equation 8 and equation 9, you eliminate del v del x, you can get an expression for del 2 v del x square. And that's exactly what we have done. We have eliminated, and I get equation 10, which is del 2 v del x square. And that is same as the previous one. That has that mean value theorem. This one, that equation 4. That has to be, otherwise there will be a lot of other issues. Same way, del 2 v del y square at node 0, equation 11. Put it in the Laplace's equation, and therefore again I get that what is the expression for V0. So this is a much rigorous derivation of the equation. And as I said, there is only one assumption I have made, that in equation 8 I have ignored the higher order terms of the Taylor series, and that will be the reason of some error in the derivation. How do I apply these equations? Say, for example, equation 12. How do I apply these equations? Yes, I have given a very simple example here. And by the way, I always say, or probably I have told you, that our problems are called boundary value problems. That means the values are typically known at the boundaries. So here in this example, I have given the values on the boundaries. These are assumed, right? Don't take it as a hard and fast. These are assumed. Just to explain. Then there are 4 nodes which I do not know the potential. So then let's take V1. How do I apply the equation 12? Please remember that equation 12 has V1, V2, V3, V4. Out of that, V1 and V3 are in the x direction, V2 and V4 are the y direction. So when you take this example, now here V1 is actually your V0 on the right hand side. Then V3 and 90 are V1 and V3 in the x direction, and 110 and V2 are V2 and V4 in the y direction of equation 12. So you have to always correlate these two, and that is written as V1 on the right side. If you take the node 2, V2, then V4 and 60 are V1 and V3 in the x direction, and V1 and 20 are V2 and V4 in the y direction. That's written on the right side. And in the same way, V3 and V4. So I get 4 equations. Now if you look at the right hand side, I have 4 equations. I have 4 variables. Can I solve it? The answer is yes. I can solve 4 unknown variables from 4 equations, and this system of equation that is being generated is therefore what is called a system of simultaneous linear equations. And you know there are so many methodologies by which I can solve that, and we can do that with the help of those techniques, and results are known. Now once these results are known, you can always ask me that if I want to know the result at any point between 1 and 3, how do I do? Or maybe between 1 square, how do I do? The answer is very simple. Because our basic assumption is that potential distribution is linear between the 2 nodes, so I can straight away apply linear interpolation techniques. These are well-established mathematical techniques, and I can get the result from the values already calculated. This is called post-processing. Post-processing. So that is quite straightforward mathematics. There is nothing so complicated here. Now, typically, we go for the iterative methods. There are quite a few iterative methods, but most commonly we use the Gauss-Seidel methodology. In that Gauss-Seidel methodology, if you are aware, that's fine. Otherwise, just have a look at that. It's always starting with assumed values of the node potentials, and then through an iteration we reach the final value. So there is a question of the old value and the calculated value. That means old value is the value of the previous step, a previous iteration. Calculated value is the value of present iteration. Now, many a times we use in the Gauss-Seidel an acceleration factor. So I have given some just very simple these things. And typically acceleration factors are of the range 1 and 2. But many times we have to be very careful that this acceleration factor, if it is very high, then what happens? The solution, it oscillates around the final value. So it will take a long time to reach the final value. On the other hand, if this acceleration factor is low, it will take a very long time. There will be no oscillation, but it will go very slowly to the final value. But if we have a good acceleration factor, then it will reach the final value without oscillation at a reasonable time. That means with reasonable number of iterations. And how do I choose it? There are a lot of studies on that. You don't have to bother. Say, if it is a square nodal region, P into P, then equation 15 is a suggestion. If it is a rectangular region, then it is P plus 1 into a Q plus 1 nodes. This is a suggestion. So we can follow these suggestions. And if these are greater than 15 or so, etc., so a lot of suggestions are given. So you can go through the node. And this is an example of how this iterative method goes. The same problem here. But here, how we use the acceleration factor is given. That means for iteration 1, we use this expression where the old value is 0 because we have started with all values to be 0. Calculated value means when we put these values, for example, in equation 1, V1 calculated, the initial value of V2 and V3 is 0. So old value of V1 and then this new value, when we put 0, I get 50. So here you can see V1 calculated is 50, V1 old is 0. So using this acceleration factor where the number of nodes is less than 15, we calculate it using one of those equations, 1.072. So I get a value 53.6. If I don't use the acceleration factor, this value will be simply 50. Just a minute. Okay. Uh, you are hearing me? Okay. So now, uh, that's how then we calculate these V1, V2, V3 at the different uh, iterative steps. But this is for problem solving. So these examples are only for your exams or assignments. Uh, but for understanding the field, this is not so important. For understanding the field, this part before this, all these acceleration factor and others, those parts are important. So this is the part where we go for the what is called equal nodal distances. But now I have to tell you that is it you know enough to have equal nodal distances? The answer is no. Let me show you that. Ah, yes. I will share one more file so that you will be able to understand. I hope now you will be able to see it. Now, hopefully, it is coming. Is it coming? Can you see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now you see, this is an example where I have three conductors. So I can say this is a transmission line system. And there is only one dielectric epsilon r, it could be air. Now, if you can see this region is quite large. So if I have to discretize with a very smaller nodal distances, the total number of nodes will be very high. So then what to do? Then the answer is, can I do unequal nodal distances? The answer is yes, of course do, but then what will be the logic of that unequal nodal distance? Logic is, there is something which we know fundamentally from the field. That means how the field varies. It is very well known that the field varies sharply near the boundaries, and it varies relatively slowly as you go away from the boundaries. Therefore, you can see here that what we have done is the region near the boundaries, you can see this circle. So, the region near the boundaries are being subdivided much more discretely with lower nodal distances, but as we are going away, the nodal distances are large. This is because with an assumption of the field distribution, that field varies sharply near the boundaries and relatively not so sharply away from the boundaries. Now, this is a quite valid assumption because this is the experience over the years. I show you another diagram so it will be clear to you. Now, here you can see this is a typical post insulator. One electrode on top, one electrode at the bottom, and here you can see the post insulator. And here also you can see that near the boundaries, we have gone for much lower nodal distances, whereas away from the boundaries, we have taken the unequal nodal distances. Similarly, another diagram. Now here you can see this is a very well-known diagram probably for you. This is the disk insulator used for our transmission lines. So here also you can see that near the boundaries we have gone for much lower nodal distances, whereas away from the boundaries like here at the top or here at the bottom we have used a larger nodal distance. So if I do that, then we have a very reasonable compromise that the total number of nodes is not very high, but at the same time that assumption that the internodal potential distribution that more or less remains close to a linear potential distribution. So therefore, we need to develop expressions for unequal nodal distances. So I'll not do it today. I'll do it in my next class. Today I gave you the all the fundamentals that how I go into the details. So what I will do is in my next class I will explain that how we do it for unequal nodal distances. So I stop today here. And if you have any questions, you can ask me on today's discussion. Uh, what you could not understand? Yes. Yeah, that is. Hmm? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, this is what I'll share again. I think then there is slight confusion here. Let me share again this one. This disk insulator problem. It will be coming. You can see the disk insulator now. Yeah. What I will do is first I will, because this geometry is of course known. Otherwise, I cannot do any field computation. That the boundary geometries has to be known. I mean, you can say this is an irregular geometry, but this is not an unknown geometry. So what I have done is I have discretized this region of interest. Now you can always say that up to what distance from the insulator is my region. That I will explain at a slightly later stage. There are certain rules for that. As you can see on the right side, there is something called a fictitious boundary. So that we will define, and then you can see that here you have a rectangle, bigger rectangle, and within this bigger rectangle I have this earth electrode, which is this one. You can see my mouse moving here, earth cap on the top. Then I have the high voltage pin here, which is the potential, whatever it is, 11 kV, 33, whatever it is. Then this one is the porcelain, which is epsilon R1. This one is epsilon R2, that is air. That I will again explain later how to do for multiple dielectrics. That now is defined. This is my region of interest. And then I discretize. Once I discretize, then you take any node here. Right? And then you get four nodes which are connected. This is how we go forward.
So how we will take the fictitious boundary?
Yeah,
How
that is that
it
is
is
that. Just wait a little bit, right? I have just started the course. Of course, I will explain how this fictitious boundary has to be taken. First, let me explain the fundamentals. Then I will also discuss what are the, this sort of practical, approaches. Otherwise, we can't compute the field. I will explain this fictitious node and all this, fictitious boundary and all those things. Then you will have a really, clear understanding. So just wait a couple of classes, you will come to know everything.
sir, and the boundary conditions we will get from the lab, and all other node values we will do the simulation in computer.
Boundary conditions are coming from the fundamental field theory, not from the lab, right? For example, this that electrode that I showed you, one clear boundary condition is that all the nodes which are located on the earth electrode, the boundary condition is that the potential is equal to zero. Then all the nodes which are lying on the high voltage electrode, the boundary condition is potential is equal to V, and V is known. Let's say 11 kV. Then for there are certain other boundaries that I have not explained today, because that I will, as I said, I will explain later. That is, There are boundaries between two dielectrics, isn't it? There is a boundary between porcelain and air. Oh, I think you are not getting it. Let me again show you. That will be good. Uh, let me show you again. It will be clear. It is now you can see it's coming. I think. Now you see. Look at it. You can see the diagram, right?
Yes, sir.
So you can see the top one, the white one, is earthed cap. This is the earthed electrode. So after discretization, some of the nodes are located on this electrode, isn't it? Clearly you can see because some lines are terminated on the electrode. So one node is generated on the electrode. The boundary condition is phi is equal to 0. Similarly, look at the high voltage pin, that white color here. Again, here the boundary condition is phi is equal to V, that is potential is V. But then look at this dark black line, that is the insulator boundary. And at this boundary, one side is porcelain, epsilon R1, the other side is air, epsilon R2. So this is the first one is called the where one line is terminated on the electrode. If you look at that boundary, you can see one side of the boundary is electrode, one side of the boundary is a dielectric. It could be porcelain or it could be air. It is called electrode dielectric boundary. Whereas in the other one side is epsilon R1, the other side is epsilon R2. So it is called dielectric boundary. So two boundaries have two different boundary conditions. In the dielectric boundary, the boundary conditions will come from the fundamental field theory. That I will explain when I will explain the development of the nodal equations for multiple dielectric. Today I have explained only single dielectric case. So I will go step by step, right? Then you will be able to understand. I have started with single dielectric and two-dimensional. I will, and of course equal nodal distance. Then I will go for two-dimensional unequal nodal distance. So you will be able to understand that. Then I will go for that is another important aspect I have not explained. I will explain this, that everything is not two-dimensional. Two-dimensional, that means field is varying with two coordinates. In Cartesian, then it is called two-dimensional. But you know there are other coordinate systems, cylindrical coordinate system, spherical coordinate system. So if I represent my system not in Cartesian but in cylindrical coordinate system, that is r theta z. If I show that in that r theta z coordinate system, field is not varying in one coordinate, but it is varying with two coordinates only, then it again becomes two-dimensional, but not in Cartesian, but in cylindrical coordinate system. But then we don't call it two-dimensional system. Then we call it an axisymmetric system. I will explain axisymmetric system because as an engineer, you must know what is an axisymmetric system. Or for that matter, not engineer, even for if you are a scientist, you must know what is called an axisymmetric system. We have so many axisymmetric systems in our practical life. So how to develop the equation in axisymmetric system? Up to that point, I will explain everything with single dielectric. Then I will move on to multiple dielectric. Now let us come to the multi-dielectric. So then you will see step by step, we will explain everything that probably you can experience in practical life. That is how I am going to do it. So you just follow the classes, you will be able to understand. Okay, then I think now you can log off. And on Wednesday, we will join for the next class. And one more thing, some students were trying to join after 15 minutes. I have not allowed them. I think 2 students. So please inform everybody that please join in time in my class. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.